Good morning, afternoon, and evening, people of the internet. This is the Hard Line, according to Stone Fruit, with powerful Tod Desmond in the co-chair with me as we discuss the history of the Western idea of progress. And as usual, these video podcasts are accompanied by articles at stonefruit.substack.com. And to introduce you, Mr. Desmond, I'll say a few words about how we met, and then maybe you could say a few more and establish your bona fides.
Okay.
So, yeah, you and I met in the core course for the University of Hawaii's Graduate Political Science Department. And we were reading The Omnivore's Dilemma. And among the other themes of that book was the omnipresence of high fructose corn syrup. And I said, well, when I was on Salvia Divinorum, I became the corn god. And you looked up and said, did you become the corn god? And I said, I did. And you said to the class, well, I believe him.
Yep, I remember. And I did believe you. It's quite an honor to be among royalty.
Well, you are an aristocrat of the intellect and spirit as well, and that's why we became such fast friends and intellectual comrades, comrades in arms. But you didn't finish at the University of Hawaii. Where did you wind up taking your PhD? And what have you been doing to pay the rent in the years that followed?
So after Hawaii, I got a master's in political science there, but I was really studying alternative future studies with Jim Dater. That's why I went there. And then I went to the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco and got a PhD in philosophy and religion with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. And I did my dissertation comparing Carl Jung's psychology to Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory. It's called Psyche Equals Singularity. So I argue that the gravitational singularity is the self, the soul, the psyche. And then I got a job teaching at the College of Southern Maryland 10 years ago. And I teach intro to philosophy, intro to ethics, intro to religion, which is good. It keeps all the basics fresh. And I work to really pay the bills as kind of an office manager for a nonprofit dedicated to agricultural research. And I turned the dissertation into a book. Psyche and Singularity is the name of the book. Jungian psychology and holographic string theory.
Superb.
Yeah.
Superb. So you have a deep background in philosophy, and I think that makes you a perfect partner to join me on this quest as we try to understand the history of the idea of progress. For me, I first started thinking about it just trying to put a label on my political beliefs, because I see myself at the center of a Venn diagram of a lot of different political philosophies. In my heart of hearts, I am, of course, an anarchist because I got turned on to the Sex Pistols in 6th grade. And
I just saw something on TV about the Sex Pistols, about their producer.
Oh, yeah? What was it about?
His own island somewhere.
What's that?
Their producer has his own island somewhere. I was just watching that a few hours ago. So,
see, synchronicity, one of your favorite topics, is showing its head already.
Yeah.
Because when Johnny Rotten sang, I want to be anarchy, I said, my 6th grade incarnation, what is this anarchy of which they speak? And by 20, I had read all of the foundational texts of anarchism, but I know enough about history to know that the longest surviving anarchist polity was 20th century Catalonia, and it only lasted 7 years. But to kill it, every side in the Spanish Civil War and every side in the Second World War to come had to gang up on it to kill it. But I'm also a revolutionary socialist. I'm also a big D liberal Democrat in the vein of FDR's New Deal or LBJ's Great Society. And I have a big background in politics, but I favor experimentation and creativity in public policy. But there's something from who we're supposed to think is the arch reactionary, the arch conservative, Edmund Burke, in reflections on the revolution in France. And he said, quote, "People who never look back to their ancestors will not look forward to posterity."
Yeah, I was surprised to see you quote Edmund Burke because you are a liberal-leaning person, and he's considered the arch conservative, very dismissive of democracy. I mean, he's got powerful intellect, but he was like Nietzsche too. But anyway, when I saw you do that, I'm like, good. That's what people need to do. You need to kind of unite opposites, not be afraid of quoting from Edmund Burke, even if you identify with the liberal side of philosophy. That's exactly what I think is needed. Kind of embracing both sides if you can.
Which you do as well. And you have released a lot of videos on YouTube, and one is about how to unite the left and the right in American politics. Where can people find you on YouTube?
God, what is my YouTube address? Tod Desmond is my is what I go by on YouTube. I don't know. I never look at myself on YouTube. But
Short and sweet, Tod Desmond.
Yeah, the series is called E Pluribus Unus Mundus. If you type that into Google, it's going to come up to my videos. I don't think anyone else uses that phrase. The Unus Mundus was what Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli called the ultimate archetype of the self, or what Plato called the idea of the good. And it's the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. So that was my, E Pluribus Unum, from many one, and I'm saying E Pluribus Unus Mundus, and I identify the Unus Mundus with the psyche equals singularity equation. So for me, that's progress, the evolution of physics and psychology, culminating in the union of both with the psyche equals singularity. How can governments be guided by that equation of ultimate unity of all psyches with each other and the megaverse of universes on the grander picture? But yeah, that was that project.
I think both of our philosophical outlooks owe a lot to the past, and not wanting to disavow it as much as a lot of people espousing modernity do. And when I say the old ways are often the best, sometimes I mean the really old ways. In part because I think it's absolutely inevitable that large-scale organized human civilization is going to gradually start collapsing in a series of slow, cascading geopolitical, economic, and ecological shocks. And as that occurs, which I think it's occurring now.
I like the casual, and society is going to collapse in a series of cascading catastrophes.
Man, what are you going to do?
Right. Well, hey, I don't think that's an implausible prediction, but
yeah, and I don't think it'll be Mad
Max.
Max. I don't think it'll be Mad Max overnight, but we'll get there eventually. And then humankind will, of necessity, revert to some kind of hybrid of Neolithic practices with a hyper-modern technological backbone. And it's going to require radically decentralized water, food production, power, sewage, and self-government at the smallest possible scale, say the watershed, or in American terms, counties, or in Hawaiian terms, because I'm in Hawaii, we met in Hawaii, the ahupua'a, that roughly pie-shaped slice from the ocean to the mountains that were roughly self-sufficient. And I think of necessity, that type of anarchist bioregion may show its head again. Well, not to say ahupua'as were anarchist bioregions, but there is some conflation in a certain sense. But so in that sense, I'm conservative, but not obviously MAGA or Fox News or culture warrior conservatives. These I consider Jacobins, French revolutionary Jacobins, because they want to use the power of the state to inflict their cultural views and values on the general population as a whole, instead of letting everyone in this small d democratic aspiration have and adhere to their own value systems. But, having said all that, if I'm in a casual conversation with someone, the label that most deftly describes who I am is progressive. But
I got a question for you, boys.
yeah, lay it on me.
When did progressive start to take predominance over the label liberal? It used to be liberal and conservative, and now it's more often progressive and conservative, which is a kind of a polarity. Conservative is tradition, progressive is progress.
Yeah.
But I just was wondering, because it used to be liberal, you wouldn't really hear progressive, you hear liberal.
That's a good question. And in what will follow, I am utilizing Thomas Frank's work, his recent book, The People, No, N-O, which is a history of populism. And he posits it with the populist party and the populist movement that arose in his home state of Kansas in the 1880s, 1890s. And it was, in largest part, the farmers of the day on the Great Plains state, but it also sought to unite the workers and the petite bourgeoisie and all of the people that didn't have the capital of that robber baron era. And they had mayors across the country. They might have even had a governorship or two. They ran several candidates for the presidency. Most famously, was it Debs who did the Crown of Silver speech? No, that was dang it. As a historian, I'm amiss. William Jennings Bryan, yes. William Jennings Bryan was the most famous populist candidate for the Progressive Party. Eugene Debs, he might be considered more of a socialist, but he was also an early progressive. And while they may have never taken great formal power, they were the largest part. Well, there were communists and socialists and other social movements that provided the pressure to get FDR to pass the New Deal. But after Henry Wallace, FDR's vice president, was kind of overthrown in a kind of party coup by the party bosses in the convention for the 1944 presidential election, in which the party bosses replaced Wallace with Harry Truman, populism started to fall to the wayside. And in the national security state that Truman oversaw the formation of after World War II, it's, as you say, it's become more liberal and conservative as the terms for left and right. And now populist, I think very incorrectly, and I think Thomas Frank would agree very incorrectly, is often utilized to describe people who are more authoritarian in nature, like Erdogan in Turkey, Organs in Hungary, and a lot of people call Trump a populist. But I think that
I mean,
this is
Hitler was a populist, right? I mean, was it you're saying populism began in Kansas with kind of
yes,
liberal populism.
the grassroots, the people of the
Yeah,
people.
right. Were they kind of socially liberal or socially conservative? I mean, Kansas is my grandfather was from Kansas, and he was Catholic. I don't know how strong the Catholic Church is out there, but it seems fairly conservative. So I'm wondering, was that initial liberal pop? Were they liberals, or were they considered conservative, or was that not the dichotomy they were working with? Was it poor versus
Yeah,
rich?
I don't think that they had the kind of culture war side, because a lot of
Right.
people say, well, I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative.
Right.
I don't think they really saw a culture war, a social side to their policy as much as they were interested in economic
Yeah.
populism. And
Right.
since the backbone of the movement were farmers, they were particularly concerned with the monopoly power of the railroads over
Yeah.
them. So I
When you
think the birth of populism was more economic in nature, and instead of, because here's the spiel I always go on, is it's not left right in contemporary America, it's top bottom.
Yeah, I know that's Jimmy Dore pushes that idea that
A
the
man of humor and righteous anger.
yeah, yeah, the maybe when the economic situation gets bad enough, then the culture war problems become muted and people are
Become less
united about
relevant,
it.
right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're really hurting and you just need to get food on the table and a roof over your head, yeah, it becomes less and less relevant when survival becomes more and more pressing.
Right. So progressive is the easiest term to use for me to use to describe my political viewpoints, but they imply progress.
Right.
And to me, progress implies indefinite economic expansion, which further implies the indefinite exploitation of finite natural resources. And since we're both psychonauts and know that all matter is merely energy condensed to a calmer, quieter form, shout out also to Bill Hicks, that I don't like the term natural resources because we came from the biosphere, we return to the biosphere. We are stardust, we become the dust of stars. But to say that we believe in progress implies that we believe in the indefinite exploitation of finite, quote unquote, natural resources. But newsflash, people, can you hear me? The bubble economy of the Earth's rape is just about over because there is nothing else left to rape.
Uh,
This,
I think people are still going to be able to dig up some things to rape on the earth. It seems
that,
like.
yeah, they will. And like I say, this will be a slow process. But in the 20th century, a petroleum geologist Hubbert came up with the idea of peak oil, and Richard Heinberg has expanded upon it.
I was just,
You're
yeah,
reading Heinberg?
just the image of rape brought up to my raping earth brought up to my mind the idea of peak oil.
Yeah.
When it
Well,
becomes more expensive
exactly.
you got to burn more oil to dig it out than is in there. So that's yeah, that's a nice finite limit. When do you reach peak oil?
Well, Hubbard said that America did in the 70s, early 70s. And we did until this moment of fracking enabled us to squeeze a little bit more out of it. But some people think that peak oil worldwide is right around now. And we're on the downward 50% of it. And as you say, there will become a moment when the energy expended to get a gallon of oil, a barrel of oil up out of the ground it will take more energy to do that than we get out of what we're attempting to get. And Richard Heinberg expands upon this to create the concept of peak everything, because it's not just oil, even though that is the blood and muscle and sinew of the industrial and post-industrial world that we live in. Everything we're out of. Everything. And so an ever-increasing population on a ravaged planet utilizing finite natural resources is mathematically impossible. It is a psychopathic omnicide, subordinating the entire biosphere to the needs of man, having well overshot our planet's human carrying capacity. And this is very well summed up in William Catton's book, Overshoot. We're done. We're out. We're reaching those limits now. If you look at the chart of the human population, it's like this, Neolithic. And then when we hit the Industrial Revolution, it becomes exponential. So then when we're out of all the oil that made the Industrial Revolution and that population spike possible, how can population not revert back to Neolithic levels? That's why I'm uncomfortable with the phrase progressive as a political label. And that's what made me want to look into, well, where did this idea come from? And part of our intellectual comradeship, well, in German, Comradeschaft, is that we are both acolytes of Nietzsche. And I think every significant...
A radically different interpretation of Nietzsche than the average Joe. I mean,
yes,
I think he was secretly a devotee of Krishna, the dancing flute-playing god, and that he was into the Krishna, Buddha, Christ theory. It was very popular in Europe and America at his time when he was writing his first book. So that his atheism was a mask, I believe. So, well, I'm a big fan of Nietzsche. Then people would assume, oh, does that mean that you think God is dead? And I said, no, I believe in God. As you know, I'm a Hare Krishna, though not a very, as far as following all the rules. There's the four regulative principles. I like the way one Hare Krishna guy once put it. Oh yeah, I follow the four regs, or the three regs: no meat, no fish, no eggs. And they leave the other ones out, but at any rate. But
yeah, and you filmed a series of YouTubes on that thesis. What's that series called?
Nietzsche, Krishna, Buddha, Christ. And I go over for the most part in those his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music. And I talk about a philological riddle that he hid in that first book. And it has to do with the German Sanskrit philologists of his day. His friend Paul Deussen was one of their ilk. He was a student of the main guys. Christian Lassen was one of them. Albrecht Weber was another. They're into this Krishna, Buddha, Christ theory. And they also pointed out that Megasthenes, the Greek historian who followed Alexander the Great into India, he started equating Greek gods with the Indian gods. And they theorized that he equated Krishna with Heracles, who the Romans called Hercules, and the god Shiva with Dionysus. So when Nietzsche talks about Heracles and Dionysus in The Birth of Tragedy, I'm saying he means Krishna and Shiva. So that gets to be an elaborate riddle that he had in there. I don't know. To get into that, I think would take us pretty far off course of that. What's the definition of progress? But well, for me, what's the definition of progress? Self-realization. Like for Plato, you quote Plato in your papers. I noticed you didn't quote the Republic, which is where he spells out the initial curriculum for academia, especially for mathematical astronomy. And for him, progress is accumulating mathematical knowledge, specifically of astronomy and music, with the attempt to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, infinitely brilliant source of all mind and matter. And that is what academia should progress towards, because no one can be just, either in private or public life, until they've opened the eye of their soul to the idea of the good, says Socrates in the Republic. And that's how I see progress. A progressive is somebody who's trying to take that academic march of progress to gain knowledge of the supreme self. And I think that idea of the good is what Carl Jung called the archetype of the self. And that's the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. So it would entail, I believe, uniting whatever archetypes drive progressives and whatever archetypes drive the conservatives. They should both see each of them as serving archetypes that are imprinted on their soul as well. And if you incline towards one side, then you should realize the archetype of the other side is also in your soul. It's just not manifesting as powerfully, but it should be at least acknowledged and synthesized. Some will always lean to the left, some will always lean to the right, but both sides, a left wing and a right wing, you want to use both wings. Why would you, limit yourself to only using one wing? You'll never take off.
Quite so. And thank you for taking an initial stab at the definition of progress. And part of what really caught my attention and made taking political science 601 so entertaining with you was at a certain stage in the evolution of the course that day, the seminar that day, you would seem to awaken from a slumber and say, well, I think we need to define our terms.
Yeah.
To have a very fruitful discussion.
Yeah.
And
you were the only one who appreciated that. Everyone else was like, oh no.
Yeah. Oh no, this mutant Krishna devotee is about to spell forth.
Right. I always gave him the first half of class, and then I said, all right, it's time to define our terms.
And that is a prerequisite for any intellectual labor. So I offer a few definitions of progress that I liked from the interwebs. And these are easily found through links at stonefruit.substack.com. And one thinker it as, quote, a cumulative process in which the most recent stage is always considered preferable and better, qualitatively superior to what preceded it. This definition contains a descriptive element, change takes place in a given direction, and an axiological element, this progression is interpreted as an improvement. This refers to change that is oriented towards the best. It is necessary and it is irreversible. Another thumbnail description of progress could be that theorists of progress, quote, differ on the direction of progress, the rate and nature of change that accompanies it, even its principal agents. Nevertheless, all adhere to three key ideas: a linear conception of time, and the idea that history has a meaning oriented towards the future, and two, the idea of a fundamental unity of humanity, which is all called to evolve in the same direction together. And three, the idea that the world can and must be transformed, which implies man as the sovereign master of nature. See, that notion of a linear progression of time, I think negates our, well, I'll speak for myself. I have a notion that time is perhaps cyclical as well. and that there's
Yeah,
recurring.
the Vedanta philosophy is it's about a 2 million year cycle of 4 different ages: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and this Iron Age, Kali Yuga. Each one is shorter than the one before. Everyone is shorter in stature. They live less long, and their intellect is less powerful. And then it starts all over again.
Yeah, but the West, with its fixation on linear time, totally ignores these alternative constructs of a cyclical type of time. And another kind of rough and ready definition of progress is very instrumental, and it says, quote, advances in technology, science, and social organization that inevitably produce an improvement in the human condition. That is, people can become happier in terms of quality of life, social progress, economic development, and through the application of science and technology. But other people besides the Vedas have brought in notions of cyclical time. People like Oswald Spengler, Decline of the West, George Sorel, Illusions of Progress. And most people looking at the idea of progress in the West think that it started in the Enlightenment, but through part 1 on stonefruit.substack.com, I lean on Robert Nisbet, a former Columbia professor, who said that, quote, the essence of Western idea of progress can be simply stated: mankind has advanced in the past, is now advancing, and may be expected to continue advancing in the future. But what, it will be asked, does advance mean? He argues that there's a dual nature to what progress can mean. Quote, to give substance to the hope for a future characterized by individual freedom, equality, or justice, the classical small L liberal of the liberal international order, which America is the self-appointed model and gatekeeper. And we're seeing that self-inflicted title might be coming to an end, Tod Desmond. But he also thinks that progress could be made to serve a belief, quote, made to serve a belief in the desirability and necessity of political absolutism, racial superiority, and the totalitarian state. So I just want to throw them all into a Cuisinart and hit liquefy.
Yeah, I mean, when reading this, you've got the substance to the hope for a future characterized by individual freedom, equality, or justice. Okay, how do you define freedom? How do you define equality? How do you define justice? Because Socrates addressed each of those, and they never can define them adequately. And then in the Republic, he has Socrates talking to these young men, and they establish a totalitarian state based on the noble lie in order to achieve justice, specifically justice in the Republic. But at least there they said, to achieve these virtues, you have to see the source of all of the archetypal absolute ideas. And that's what they call the idea of the good, which is what I talked about earlier. So that at least is a well-defined goal for progress to be made. But it unites both of these, not the racism part, but definitely political absolutism and the totalitarian state. Although I believe, and Alan Bloom, the neocon disciple of Leo Strauss, believes that Plato's Republic is an intentional farce to show that if you're motivated to create justice in society, how easily it can become this totalitarian tyranny. I got other theories about the Republic, but at any rate, this scholar Nisbet, I think, accurately defined these two different sides of what progress is, but he doesn't give any indication of how he would define his fundamental terms, even in these It's nice. He's narrowed it down to one level, but he didn't go down to that next level. He never defined a self. What is an individual? There's individual freedom. What is an individual? What is the self? That's an ancient philosophical question that's not easy to answer.
I think that Nisbet takes it for granted that people will just kind of plug in the small L liberal democratic stereotypes for those types of ideas like freedom, equality, and justice. But the Western philosophical tradition, quite arguably, started with the Greeks, and it hasn't come to a firm conclusion on what those simple and basic terms mean.
It's not easy to define any terms, especially ones that are that fundamental and important for the political body.
Yeah, so for me, neither did I. I just threw them all into a Cuisinart and hit liquefy. And here's my rough and ready definition is the multifaceted social movement compounding an overall spiritual, moral, intellectual, scientific, technological, and material improvement. There's perhaps the slipperiest word in the state of mankind. But to my mind, it is highly debatable whether it's even happening now in the midst of contemporary neoliberal globalization. And as much as I love Nietzsche, so do I also love the beat poets and beat writers. And legendary beat poet Gregory Corso gave us a wonderful little chestnut to the effect of the Greeks gave us fate, the Romans gave us fortune, the Catholics gave us hope, and the Enlightenment gave us free will. So let's use it. So I think that is why I like Nietzsche so much, is that he genealogicizes everything. He looks for their origin and how they've evolved. And because we live in a realm, a social world that takes free will for granted, we think it's always been there. But even someone who's a poet like Corso can note in that typology, that periodization, that it evolved out of something else, and it evolved in the Enlightenment. So I think it's food for thought. I think it's decent as a rough and ready typology of the ongoing social construction of human agency. But I might propose a slightly different and perhaps more comprehensive typology. Where Nisbet is different from most is that most social commentators think that a self-conscious sense of cultural progress dates from the Enlightenment onward. I follow him in going back and giving careful scrutiny to the Greeks and the Romans. And that's why I'm delighted to have you aboard as a partner in crime on this exciting episode for our dozens of faithful listeners of the Hard Line, according to Stone Fruit. Because you have that background in Greek philosophy. And so let's start with the Greeks. Let's go back to Hesiod in his 1750 to 650 BC Works and Days. Wow, Tod, brah. I had read maybe a few of Plato's dialogues in college. I had read a few of the Greek plays in high school and college, knew their general place in the intellectual infrastructure, but I had beyond that was the extent of my knowledge of the ancient Romans and Greeks. And the more I got into their primary materials, because I didn't read all the things that all the works that I'm going to cite. I didn't read them from front cover to back cover. I just went on a hunting expedition to find what I needed about the word of progress. But it was a deeper exploration of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans that I have hitherto done. And it was exciting. And Works and Days, Hesiod, it's a cavalcade of all the myths, figures, and sites that are familiar to people with even a superficial understanding of Greek mythology. Zeus, Prometheus, which I didn't know, it means foresight, and his brother is Epimetheus, which means hindsight. Athena, Aphrodite, Hermes, Kronos, Pandora, Olympus, Hades, Oedipus, Helen of Troy, they all have their cameos in Works and Days. And I see your intellectual labor in part as kind of a sociology of the philosophy of astrology, because you put a lot of weight and importance in astrology as a means of the Western mind articulating key archetypes of personality, of cultural processes, of trades, and that the gods are ascribed to planets, and
Yeah,
the gods have.
I follow Richard Tarnas. I went to study at the California Institute of Integral Studies. That's where he still teaches. That was back in 2010. But Kaleki, Intimations of a New Worldview, that's his book, 2006, about using astrology to analyze the history of basically Western philosophy, and how you can see the cyclical planetary alignments in this geocentric cosmology, with Earth in the center and the planets all in the outermost circle of the horoscope chart. And these, you've got your 90-degree increments of angles. Those are the hard angles, the conjunction, the square, 90-degree, the opposition, the next square, and then a conjunction again of whatever planets are involved in a particular historical phase. But yeah, definitely, because he wrote The Passion of the Western Mind, which is a great single-volume history of Western thought. I was so impressed with that, which I picked up in 1993. He published it in 92. That someone stole my book bag out of my car when I was moving in DC back in 2006. And I was like, oh, that's unfortunate for me. But I went to the bookstore to get a new copy of The Passion of the Western Mind, which I got to have with me. And there they had on display Cosmos and Psyche. He made the cover himself. It's like somebody with a bow and arrow and all the gods. I was like, what? I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I kind of believed in astrology, but I thought it was a lost science. But I was like, well, if anybody can explain this in a believable way, it's this guy. So I bought the book. And then after about a year, while I was in Hawaii, I really started noticing in my own life how it applies. And then, using that to understand the archetypal evolution of civilization is really fascinating. And it opens that eye of the soul. I think Socrates in the Republic, in the myth of at the end of the Republic, the near-death experience of the soldier he wakes up on his own funeral pyre and he recalls this cosmology. Well, the one Oxford scholar, I forget his name, but he's in my book, Psyche and Singularity. He pointed out the language he uses to describe these planetary orbits around the Earth are the ones they use in astrology. So combining a near-death experience of the horizon of the cosmos, and they have these threads of destiny interwoven at the horizon of the cosmos through each of the planetary orbits, the three fates, the sisters, past, present, and future, down to the central Earth. And so combined astrology and string theory and this near-death experience of the cosmic horizon, that was the essence of my dissertation in my book. And it all ties in. So I mean, for me, the future state will be enlightened, among other things, by astrology, archetypal astrology, understood in this cosmological framework that has reemerged with holographic string theory, which brings us full circle back to what Plato describes in his dialogues, like the Timaeus and the Phaedrus and the Republic. That's what's so amazing to me, that archetypal cosmology that from which academia began. Leonard Susskind, in the name of atheism, anti-Platonic if anybody is, ironically, gave us the best mathematical description, although I don't understand the mathematics. I take his word on it. I take Stephen Hawking's word that, yeah, this is correct. And that's a fascinating evolution and progress in academia there, the whole whatever else might have been going wrong in civilization, our academic knowledge of the heavens has been progressing very well, I think. And that it came full circle back to this ancient cosmology of the Akasha, this all-knowing mind of the cosmos out there, where space-time is expanding away from Earth at the speed of light from our geocentric perspective. That cosmology makes astrology seem a lot more plausible. And synchronicities in general, you mentioned that earlier. Meaningful coincidences seem more understandable if the past, the present, and the future of our fate, our psyche, and the entire material world is interwoven at each point of this encompassing sphere.
And myth used to mean bullshit, falsehood in the mid to late 20th century. And I would argue it was not until Joseph Campbell came along that the Academy started to see myth as a respectable repository of universal narratives and symbols, many of which can be found all over the world in varying but similar ways. And a quick personal aside, interestingly, when I was my first 2 years of undergraduate, we're at Sarah Lawrence College, and
in Massachusetts.
And that is set up to be half your classwork and half what you pursue with your dawn in what I believe is a Oxford, Cambridge, UK type of system. And my dawn's best friend was Joseph Campbell.
Oh yeah,
because
yeah, you told me that.
That's where Campbell taught. And so I was pretty hip pretty early in my intellectual journey that myth does not need to be a pejorative word. And in digging into, because what do? They explain, predict, and control the natural and social worlds and provide comfort, solace, and delight. I mean, narratives, the novel, poetry, scientific hypotheses, they all explain, predict, control, provide solace, comfort. So,
and Joseph Campbell, following Jung, would say scientific theories and myths often parallel each other because they all are rooted in these archetypes of the collective unconscious.
And when they try and understand an aspect of the social world, they try to understand that by understanding a natural scientific basis behind it too, which will come up again as we continue to discuss. But to dig into Works and Days as to how it applies to the beginning of an idea of progress in the West. You know, I'd always thought that Gold Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age were ages. But once I actually read the book, these were races. And they were degenerating from those metals and the alloy of bronze to the Iron Age, which reminds me a lot of our present day. But between the Bronze and Iron Ages, there was, not ages, races, there was another race that is rarely discussed when this is fed to people in secondary school. And this was a race of heroes, a kind of a return to the golden race, demigods almost. A godlike, quote, a godlike generation of men who were heroes, who are called demigods. Now, I consider that the first iteration of the idea of progress in Western intellectual history. And while fate is certainly one of the primary organizing principles in ancient Greece, they said you had to observe the appropriate ritual observances to the gods. And if you do that and avoid hubris, man can have a certain freedom within fate. And as Xerophanes, 560 to 478 BC, noted that the gods also left us another sphere of human freedom by not disclosing everything to us all at once. quote, "The gods have not revealed all things to men from the beginning, but by seeking, they find in time what is better." And as we're going to find, I think again and again, so much of ancient Greek thought seems perpetually modern. Like Xerophanes, when he bemoaned how into athletic conferences everyone in ancient Greece around him was. And he said, speaking of the philosophers, "For our expertise is better than the strength of men or horses. But this practice makes no sense, nor is it right to prefer strength to this good expertise." And, we can substitute smartphones and TV and the interwebs and cable and bread and the modern iterations of Roman bread and circuses as our kind of present day athletic contests and horsemanship contests of ancient Greece. Because here's a professor, Xerophanes, a smart guy, an intellectual, saying the masses are too distracted by popular culture. And, that was 2,000 years ago, and people are still making the same claim today. People like some of my profound intellectual forebears, like the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, and the dialectical imagination talked about the culture industry, which for them mid 20th century was TV, radio, film. And I think that's even gotten worse, because if we're ever in the public sphere now, Todd, and people have a moment to themselves, they just immediately revert to their smartphone.
Yeah. I think a lot of people do it out of just nervousness and embarrassment to make eye contact. It seems it's not a healthy trend for sociability of the species.
And the boomers and people older than them were giving Generation X, us, shit about MTV. Oh, these quick edits are going to destroy their ability to concentrate. Well, I think now that we have smartphones, and they're so omnipresent and ubiquitous that further shatters people's attention span and ability to memorize and retain too, because everything becomes searchable.
Yeah, right.
But Xerophanes also began what I might call the Western tradition of rugged skepticism as one of the best ways to enhance our free agency. But this was always in conjunction with the gods. He still hadn't left them entirely behind. He said, quote, "There never was nor will be a man who has certain knowledge about the gods and about all the things I speak of, even if he should chance to say the complete truth. Yet he himself knows that it is not so. But all men have their fancy. Let these fancies be taken as something like the truth." I've seen fancies translated different ways. It's not quite opinion, it's not quite belief, but he's saying that's all we have is our best guesses. And there is, we've both looked at epistemology and Western epistemology, and there is definitely a durable strand of skepticism within it.
Yeah, what he says there reminds me of, I believe it's the dialogue, the Phaedo, where Socrates drinks the hemlock in the end. So all day in the prison cell, they're waiting for sunset when he has to drink the hemlock. And he's trying to convince them that the soul doesn't die. And they go through three different theories. Opposites come from opposites. If day comes from night, and night from day, and cold from hot, and hot from cold. We know death comes from life because living things die. Therefore, maybe life comes from death. After you die, you're born again. That was one theory. Then the theory of the archetypes, like equality, he mentioned there. He says, you've never seen two things that are absolutely equal. And yet you know when things approximate equality and when they don't. So if you've never observed absolute perfect equality, how is it that you know the standard by which to measure relative equality among physical things? You must have been born with that knowledge. And since the idea of equality is eternal, and you're born with that knowledge, it implies that your soul is also eternal. That was his argument for the eternal soul. By knowledge is remembering. You don't learn anything, you just remember things you forgot from the phase between lives, when you see those absolute ideas at the horizon of the cosmos in between lives, and then you forget them again when you're born again. And then his third argument was the argument by analogy, which I'm not going to talk about. But at any rate, at one point, and it wasn't Socrates who said it, it was one of the interlocutors he was talking with. They were saying, all these theories are like rafts that you pick your best raft and you float on the tossing seas of doubt and skepticism, and that's the best we can do. And that the better your theory is, the more suitable of a raft you'll have. And when I was reading here what you'd written. Now you're saying Xenophanes. Is it Xenophanes? Is it Xenophon? I've only read, he wrote like about Socrates just like Plato did. But at any rate.
Yeah, I don't know. This is one of those words that I have never encountered it verbally spoken.
Yeah, he was another. Plato's the one we know of Socrates from the most, but Xenophon also wrote some Socratic dialogues.
Here's one you can help me pronounce. Aeschylus, the dramatist?
Oh, Aeschylus.
Aeschylus. Okay.
Yeah, Aeschylus. Yeah, I'm no expert on these guys. I did take a class on the Greek tragic poets, though. So Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles.
Right. And we're about to jump into them in our survey of the Greeks. And I'll relate a quick personal anecdote of when I was backpacking across the world, and I'm in Athens and I'm up at the Parthenon at 9 a.m. It's already swarming with thousands of fat German tourists. And much to my chagrin, the Parthenon itself is in chunks all over. I don't know what you would describe it. If you're familiar with the Southwest, it looked like a mesa to me. And the chunks of the Parthenon are just all over the place on this mesa. Oh man, that sucks. Oh man, the tourists everywhere sucks. So I just started walking. I left, started walking. It has a good museum. I started walking around the base of the mesa, and I find this path, and I see this very deep, large, majestic amphitheater. And oh, that's cool. I think that's where the Blues Brothers are playing next weekend. Minus Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, alas. But I found this path, and I started walking along it, and I saw a sign that said, "This is the Peripatos, the path that the ancient philosophers strode."
Peripatetics.
Yeah. And I'm, holy shit, this is what peripatetic means, which I can relate to because I'm a vagabond. I'm peripatetic. And this is where they actually walked and talked. It was mind-blowing. And then I walked further down that path, and I found a far more humble, far smaller amphitheater that I would say a diameter of about 40 feet max, maybe more like 30 feet. And one half was the stage, and the other half was the seating. And it was, the seating area was just 3 half circles that were separated by maybe 6 inches of stone. Not much at all. Very modest. It couldn't have held more than a few dozen people, I should imagine. And the sign there said, "This is where Aeschylus? Aeschylus. This is where Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles premiered their plays." So again, I was, wow, this is where it all happened.
Yeah, that was Nietzsche's big thing in The Birth of Tragedy, how this magical technology of the soul, the Greek theater, that they would they would work themselves up into a religious fervor and see the God behind the masked figure would be transubstantiated with the power of music, which he followed Schopenhauer in saying is the immediate language of the underlying will of the universe, could enable the whole crowd to have a hallucination. But you're saying it was pretty small. The whole crowd would, because the way I was imagining it when he would write about it was the bigger one, where it'd be like all the citizens, it was like whatever, 500 male citizens. They had all kinds of slaves and everything, but there weren't that many actual free men of Athens who could vote and go to these kinds of productions.
There was slavery too, right?
Yeah, I think it was 9/10 slaves.
Yeah.
Which was pretty standard back then for a city-state.
Right. So people like one of my contemporary heroes, Jeffrey Sachs, can look to Aristotle and his ethics as one of the earliest iterations of how do we cultivate a civic culture of virtue. And that's great. And that started the discussion back in ancient Greece, but it was on the foundation of slavery too.
That was one of Nietzsche's big points, that you can't have progress. This is what he wrote in The Birth of Tragedy, that once they realize that this progress of civilization is built on the backs of slaves, that was what tragic plays were ostensibly meant to heal. The division between the stratas of society, they go to these tragic plays, and that would tune them into this underlying unity of the will that permeates everyone and everything in the universe. Whereas the veil of Maya would be tattering in the breeze before them, and this, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, he said, if you can imagine that, everyone's worked up into this surge of universal love for the suffering God. But how it's, the Alexandrian era, he says, requires slavery. And then, if you think about it, what great civilization isn't built on the back of slaves? I really can't think of any. It's not to justify slavery, it's just a brutal fact of history. Can you have the kind of time for people like Aeschylus and Socrates, although he was a barefoot wanderer, didn't live in any kind of luxury, but Plato was an aristocrat. Can you have that kind of hyper-refined intellectual caste that forwards civilization with their leisure time without some form of slavery? There's a big question for progressives. Can you have a sustained progress of civilization and equality and even equity? Nietzsche would seem to me argue, no, you cannot. But that what you can do is unite the intellectual class with the laborer class, and they don't have to be abject slaves, but there has to be this kind of stratification of society based on, I know that for the Vedanta philosophy, which Nietzsche loved, the idea of the caste system. Brahmins at the top, like a pyramid, the intellectuals who are renounced from material pleasures, the Kshatriyas, the warrior administrators, who are very egotistical, but they fight their own wars. They don't expect the slaves to fight their wars to accumulate more slaves. Then the businessmen, the Vaishyas, and then the laborers, the Shudras. And then beneath that is the outcast, the Chandalas. I know Nietzsche wrote a lot about that in his later phase. But that, if you're going to talk about progress, there's a big one. Can you have progress and equality for everybody? How could you do that? And if other societies don't, and they use slaves like the old school to forward their civilization, can an egalitarian society compete with something like that, a totalitarian state? And how would they compete? Those are all interesting questions.
So fundamental and so inextricably bound with the birth of Western thought itself in ancient Greece. And I'm looking at God damn it, I can't pronounce his name. Say it for me one time, Todd.
What, Aeschylus?
Aeschylus.
I hope I'm saying it right. But
Aeschylus.
that's how the teacher I learned about Aeschylus from said it. So
Aeschylus, one of his most famous plays is Prometheus Bound. And that is one in which Prometheus is punished by Zeus for bringing fire, which is kind of a metaphor for technology, to man. And this is the first of what will be many of these thinkers have long lists of what they think constitute progress. And his version was that Prometheus brought mythic patterns, mythic figures. He brought brick architecture, arithmetic, writing, the domestication of animals, astronomy, ocean-going vessels, open sea navigation, medicine, metallurgy. But the playwright still had Prometheus say that all of this was steered by, quote, the three formed fates and the unforgetting furies. So we can start to see what's in the inventory, what's in the catalog of quote unquote progress, but that it's still steered by fate and the furies. And one of the other great dramatists, Sophocles, also had necessity and fate as ruling principles. But within that, there was
Ananke,
what?
just Ananke, I believe, is the Greek word for fate.
Ah,
Ananke.
yeah. I'd love to read the ancient Greeks in Greece. I'd love to read Nietzsche in German, but alas,
If it was the Groundhog Day movie.
yes, we would teach ourselves many languages, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Uh, but Sophocles, another great Greek dramatist, in his Antigone, he wrote about again the domestication of animals, improvements in intellectual reflection, rhetoric, medicine, law. But he said, speech and thought fast as the wind, and the moods that give order to a city he has taught himself, and how to flee the arrows of inhospitable frost under clear skies, and the arrows of the storming rain. He has resources for everything, lacking resources in nothing. He strides towards what must come. From Hades alone he shall procure no escape. But from hopeless diseases he has designed flights. Possessing resourceful skill, a subtlety beyond expectation, he moves now to evil, now to good. When he honors the laws of the land and the justice of the gods to which he is bound by oath, he stands high in the polis. So he can be one of those 10% of the free men, they were men, that sit astride the 90% slaves in these ancient Greek polities.
Right. And treating themselves as equals was considered a big novelty.
Yeah.
Like even though they had mostly slaves, still the natural born Athenian males were free, and that wasn't easy for them. That was their direct democracy too.
Yeah. And the main innovation of the Stoics to me was how to accommodate necessity and fate with strength, grace, ease. And in that was their freedom. And Zeno the Stoic has got some wonderful chestnuts like, man conquers the world by conquering himself. Well being is attained little by little, but nevertheless is no little thing itself. And here's a great little cinematic image. When a dog is tied to a cart, if it wants to follow, it is pulled and follows, making a spontaneous act coincide with necessity. But if the dog does not follow, it will be compelled in any case. So it is with men. Even if they do not want to, they will be compelled to follow what is destined.
Yeah, didn't St. Paul say don't buck against the goat? The goat is what I think they use to make elephants move Maybe they got that when they were in India, the Alexandrians. But at any rate, the idea of you can either go peacefully with fate or you can be dragged by fate. But either way, you're going where you're fated to go. You know, before I forget, this whole idea of fate and freedom, I think, needs to take into account the radical revolution of 20th century physics, especially Einstein, because as early as 1905, with special relativity, the scientific community has agreed that the past, the present, and the future are fixed. That was Einstein's big thing. He was a huge determinist. That it appears as if we're evolving over time, but really it's a four-dimensional space-time continuum. And although we see the past disappearing and we're not there in the future, just like in front of me is there, even though I'm right here, and behind me is there, even though I'm here in space. If space and time are interwoven, then even though I'm not in the future, it's still there. Just like in front of me in space is there, so is in front of me in time. And behind me in time is just as real as behind me in space. Even though we're experiencing it in this piecemeal way, past, present, and future coexist. And I know a lot of the ancient cosmologies say the same thing, and these near-death experiences that have tied the ancient to the modern is very similar to the myth of Carl Jung's near-death experience, very similar. You know, any near-death experience, they have these characteristics that are the same. But how do you account for Einstein saying the past, the present, and the future coexist? Wherein lay the progress if the future's fixed? Are you really progressing toward it, or is it this predetermined point in space-time, which is already there, but we're under the illusion that it hasn't occurred yet? You can throw in the megaverse of universes that definitely opens up a field of possibilities, but every universe in the megaverse is similarly eternally fixed, with the past, the present, and the future fixed. That's one way I try to unite freedom and determinism, is that you can choose from an infinite variety of possible choices. There's no limit. But no matter which choice you make in that infinite array of possibilities, all of them are fixed. So you have infinite freedom and infinite determinism united with this megaverse of universes theories. But it definitely throws a monkey wrench in the idea of progress. I don't know if you've thought, I mean, we've talked about this kind of thing a lot. I don't know if you've cultivated any new opinions about it.
Well, there's also the theory of the Akashic record, that the past, present, and future are already known and written.
Yeah, that is what string theory brings in. Einstein's like the past, the present, and future coexist in this four-dimensional block-like universe, like a loaf of bread. But then Leonard Susskind and Gerard 't Hooft, the Nobel Prize winner in physics from the Netherlands, they, to defeat Stephen Hawking's claim that black holes erase information, they came up with the theory that although it seems that information is erased by a black hole, from the perspective of someone outside a black hole, it's smeared out around the event horizon and then released with the Hawking radiation. And the universe is an inside-out black hole, expanding from a singularity instead of contracting into one. And that the past, the present, and the future are conserved specifically at the horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding away from us at the speed of light. And it radiates back in on these threads of energy with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang. And string theory says all energy is made of these fundamental elastic strings. But at any rate, it's a dead ringer for the Akasha. That is the Akashic record, the horizon of the cosmos, where the past, the present, and the future are interwoven at each point. Plato says the same thing in the Timaeus, and the Hindus call it the Akasha, translated as ether, earth, water, fire, air, ether. So yeah, but then the point is, the past, present, and future, like a holographic film, are recorded out there, and we're living in a cinematic hologram or a holographic movie. And in a movie, the past, the present, and the future are fixed. And string theory says that we live in this holographic movie, which is very interesting. But what does it say about progress? Since that's the theme of this of these series of papers here?
I think the conventional framing of the Western intellectual adventure is from determinism to free will. But I think that you're bringing up the superb point that particularly contemporary science and quantum physics and other kind of cutting edge elements of 20th century science and present day science take us back in many important ways to a kind of a deterministic universe that the Greeks explained as fate and the gods and myth. And the gods were often anthropomorphized images of professions and moods and social and occupations and social patterns. But if we stay with this conventional Western narrative of free will, of determinism to free will, then we could look at another ancient Greek thinker like Thucydides, who's getting a lot of press lately because
Oh, really?
some big shot Harvard guy wrote an article that turned into a book called Thucydides' Trap. And because Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War was about the war between Athens and Sparta.
Right.
And one won and the other lost, and they went to war. And so this big shot at Harvard looked at about 15 other examples in history of when a reigning power was overthrown. And did it lead to war or didn't it? And in most cases, it did lead to war. So his whole thesis is, as China overtakes America, is America going to go to pointless war to try and preserve its place? And I think that is a open question, not impossible, but for a different stimulating episode of the Hard Line, according to Stonefruit, perhaps with Tod Desmond in the future. But back to the ancient Greeks. So Thucydides laid out a long inventory, and I won't get into it because as we march onward to the conclusion, I'll talk about how each of these thinkers, they all made their case for what counted as progress in terms of cultural artifacts in a kind of anthropological way. And the tension is between those anthropological material artifacts of progress and the social technology that got them there. And in Plato's Protagoras, he said, yeah, we have to ritually observe the gods, but beyond that, there is a realm of freedom. And he's one of the first people to talk about how education can get us there. And Protagoras was a sophist, was he not?
Yeah, I think he was a sophist.
So a philosophical teacher for hire, basically.
Yeah, to teach you how to. Their assumption was there are no absolute eternal truths, and in Athens, at least in those days, anybody could bring anybody else up on charges in court. So you had to learn to defend yourself in court. And since there's no absolute truth, you had to learn how to play on words and use them in one way in the one situation, and then flip the meaning in a way that can dupe the jury. And for politics, to convince people to vote for you, they would teach you how to manipulate language and emotional sentiments of people to get what you wanted. And they would charge people money to teach them how to do that. And Socrates was their enemy. He's like, there are absolute standards of truth, and that's what education should be focused on discovering. What are they? These absolute ideas.
And in Protagoras, Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, was saying, man, oh my God, Sophocles, you got to check this out, man. Protagoras is in town. He's the baddest motherfucker around. I want to study with him. And in Plato's dialogue, he's, wait, hold on. Quote, were you expecting the kind of instruction you get from a teacher of writing or the harp or from a physical trainer? For is it not with a view to becoming a practitioner? It is not that you have developed proficiency in these subjects, but to acquire an education suited to be an independent free man. Independent free man is the first time we hear about the ends of education, the goals of education. And it's like you said, to be able to speak clearly in the meetings of the free white men of property.
Yeah,
in the polis.
I think it was all white, but I don't think too concerned with skin color. As far as like, I mean, they knew about the Persians who were darker skinned, and they didn't say, "Oh, that makes them inferior." But
yeah, that's true, because they were operating within a Mediterranean system, which already had many shades.
Yeah, they were more. Their bigotry was more Athenians and Greeks, and if you're not a Greek,
Right.
then you're
Barbarians. Us and everybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Romans called the German whores the barbarians because they talk bar. They call them barbarians. Yeah, it was why that I took some class in the evolution. Maybe it was we had the same class about the evolution of race. Where did the idea of race come from? I don't know if you were in that one. It was with the chair of the department, the German guy.
Porteous.
Yeah, I forget.
Oh no, the chair of the department. Yes.
Yeah, he was. I think it was in one of his classes, but it was interesting. Like they didn't think in terms of race. When did even race really become an issue? And I think they were saying mainly it was the United States of America with the slaves. That's when it really became an issue of skin color. Race was the ultimate determining factor of your status in society.
Yeah, and the National Socialists, the Nazis, relied on a lot of the eugenics and racial laws of the United States as guidebooks. And in fact,
didn't Hitler,
the building that you and I met in is called Porteous Hall.
Okay.
And it was named after a professor at the University of Hawaii called Porteous. But he was actually one of the founding fathers of American racial theory. So that's why they renamed Porteous Hall to whatever it was when we were studying there.
Right, okay.
But, I played soccer at Punahou Preparatory Academy in Honolulu with an offspring of Mr. Porteous. And so that family was of such a stature that he was one of those kids at Punahou, an incredibly stratified school that was kind of a made man. So if you were from these old prominent families, missionary families, commercial families, banking families, you were a made man. And this guy, even though his family was so that one of their leading lights had such a problematic intellectual history that they renamed a building that was named after him to something else, his offspring was still welcome at the highest echelons of prestige in Punahou School.
Right.
Be that as it may. So in the Platonic dialogue Protagoras, was it Sophocles that was, no, not Socrates. Socrates was quoted as saying, Hippocrates here, on associating with Protagoras, will, on the very first day he spends time with him, depart a better man. And every day thereafter, he will develop in this manner. Because that's the pitch Protagoras was making to Hippocrates.
Right.
But Socrates asked, but in what direction? Protagoras, and in relation to what?
There you go. That's the fundamental question that you're addressing in this series of papers.
Yeah, and your FUD PhD, piled higher and deeper, is in philosophy, and mine is in education, especially policy. And so when I hear the first iterations of what are the actual goals of education, my ears definitely prick up. And in a subsequent or in another dialogue, Plato has Socrates in action again. And let's see what he says. Do you have, I don't want to be the one to read all these long quotes. Do you have this up on your side at all?
Yeah, what? You're at the Statesman now.
Yeah. You want to read the In the First Ages, just so that we
Yeah,
have
sure.
variation of voices? Go for it.
Okay. Now I don't know who was reading this because it could have been any one of the characters. Was
That's
it
true.
Socrates?
I don't know.
Well, it's just in the first ages they were still without skill or resource. The food which once grew spontaneously had failed, and yet they knew not how to procure it because they had never felt the pressure of necessity. For all these reasons, they were in a great strait. Wherefore also the gifts spoken of in the old tradition were imparted to man by the gods, together with so much teaching and education as was indispensable. Fire was given to them by Prometheus, the arts by Hephaestus and his fellow worker Athene, seeds and plants by others. From these is derived all that has helped to frame human life, since the care of the gods, as I was saying, had now failed man or men, and they had to order their course of life for themselves and were their own masters, just like the universal creature whom they imitate and follow, ever changing as he changes, and ever living and growing at one time in one manner and at another time in another. So I guess that's kind of a evolution of human civilization from more simplistic. That kind of reminds me of Adam and Eve. Isn't the implication that they were taken care of, the human species, by the gods at one point, but then the gods stopped taking care of them, and yet they still depended on these gifts from the gods.
And this becomes a realm of freedom for Plato. It's prior to him, if we just did the ritual observances, everything would be copacetic. But he's saying the mutual aid partnership between gods and man of us doing the ritual observances and them taking care of us had failed. And in the failure of the gods, a greater sphere for free will began to emerge. And in the other dialogue, the laws, it went through another litany of what constitutes civilization, but it also, for this anarchist, had a nice phrase: the community which has neither poverty nor riches will always have the noblest principles. And it also mentions rebuilding after a deluge. Have you followed any of Graham Hancock's work?
I know the name, but I forget what he was talking about.
I first got turned on to him in Joe Rogan podcast many years ago.
Yeah.
And he is a journalist, not a scientist or an anthropologist, but he has a thesis that he's hanging on to like a bulldog, that all around the world, there are numerous sites that indicate a very well-organized society, maybe 10 to 12,000 years BC, or is it ago? A long time ago, much further back than, say, 5,000 years for Mesopotamia, China, Egypt, as kind of the oldest centers of civilization, much, much older, that have completely disappeared. And
wait, didn't he write something about apocalypse? Something he had a
Ancient Apocalypse.
Yeah, is that the guy?
That's now a Netflix series.
All right, because my brother and my sister-in-law were both watching that just a week ago, and I watched a little bit of it. Yeah, it was 12,000 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, that's his theory, and like they wouldn't let the snake mounds somewhere in the United States, like Ohio, they wouldn't let them.
Snake mounds in Ohio, Indiana.
They wouldn't let them look at it. They're like, we're not letting you look at it because we know you're going to tell us things that we know are not true. And he was like,
Yeah.
what kind of
That's
ridiculous,
not science.
yeah, what kind of censorship, and you know for a fact, so there's no more room for
Right.
progress of knowledge because you got it all. Yeah, his point
Yeah.
was that all those mountains, they're all astronomically, they're built with a view to seeing the rising sun and at the different solstices and different. Yeah. I saw a few of those like just a week ago.
And he finds them in Malta, Indonesia, off of Japan, throughout the world. And it's just interesting. I bring it up because in the laws, Plato's The Laws, they mention rebuilding after a deluge, because building is one of the key elements of progress: urbanization, building, brick architecture, multi-story buildings.
Yeah.
Moving out of the Platonic dialogues into Aristotle's Poetics, he describes urbanization as well, but he also mentions that these cities were nearly, quote, nearly or quite self-sufficing as the first proto-states, and that these polities, quote, originated in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life. So why do cities exist? As to why should we be educated? What are the ends of education? What is the end of urbanization? And after those illustrious dudes, we get to someone that I think spoke more about free will than most of the ancient Greeks, Epicurus, which, I think Epicureanism gets a mainstream rap as a hedonism,
Yeah.
the Epicurean, the gourmet, but he saw it more as freedom of the body from pain and freedom of the soul from confusion. That's a quote.
Yeah. When when I was a freshman in college at Boston College, I learned about the Epicureans: eat, drink, and be merry. So I thought they were party animals. So I wrote
Yeah, me too.
Epicurean on the back of my jeans jacket. And then when I actually read Epicurus, it's more like eat bread, drink water, and be content.
Yeah,
Definitely minimize desires as much as possible. That's how you become free.
that's true. And that was a shock I went through as well when I finally started reading the primary materials instead of just taking everything second and third hand.
Yeah.
And in his letter to Menoetius, he laid out the most explicit argument for free will in ancient Greek thought. Quote, some things happen of necessity, others by chance, others through our own agency. For he sees that necessity destroys responsibility and that chance is inconstant, whereas our own actions are autonomous, and it is to them that praise and blame naturally attach. Ancient Greek mic drop right there.
Yeah. Yeah. His big thing was about be free from the fear of death.
Yeah, a lot about that.
Yeah. And he says, don't worry about death because you'll never experience, because when it is there, you won't be. Because life is sensation, death is the lack of sensation. So when death comes, you're gone. You'll never taste it. So what you're really afraid of is something that you'll never experience. And don't worry about the gods punishing you in the afterlife, because that's not going to happen either. You're not going to go to heaven. You're not going to go to hell. You're going to cease to exist. And that will free you from fear of hell and hope for heaven, and help you live a happy little life of little suffering. That's what equates happiness with absence of suffering. It's not the
Pain in the
positive
body and
present.
confusion in the mind.
Yeah, right. Just a peacefulness.
Yeah, he really dwelt a lot on the fear of death. And one of my earliest childhood memories is I'm 6 or 7. I'm I'm holding my knees curled up in a bundle, sitting on the toilet, just crying my eyes out. And I'm thinking, what happens if, and then my mom comes in to comfort me and she says, what's wrong? What's wrong? What if when we die, we're just covered with dirt and that's it? And
Right.
like an Epicurean disciple, she said, well, then you'll be covered with dirt and you won't notice.
Yeah, right.
And I was oddly comforted.
Yeah. I mean, I
And
do
I
believe in a soul, but
and
if
I
I
think
didn't,
that's what I I think that's what Epicurus is saying in Letters to Menatius. And I've been encountering a lot of death lately. I had a favorite uncle, a kind of a third father to me, recently pass, and at his funeral, I saw my biological father, who I haven't seen in years, and the boomer cohort, and all these people who used to be, a lot of them full of vim and vigor and physical vitality. Some of them uh, brawlers in their day are all using walkers and canes.
yeah,
And, and I
heard that.
recently got a certified nurse aide credential, and I'm actually doing care in a long-term nursing facility. And we warehouse our young in schools, and we warehouse our old in nursing facilities. The youth so that the adults can work, the old so that because they take too much care that we can't give them, and because we want to put them out of our sight too.
Yeah, my dad just died, but he the whole decay of the body unto death. He lived that long. It was terrible.
Yes. And one of the one of the tasks I do the most providing care is to change disposable briefs, clean them up, and reposition them on the bed.
Yeah. So they don't get bed
And
sores.
they don't get bed sores, and they're not covered with urine or feces. And many of them can't verbalize anymore. All they do is watch TV. I don't know if they're absorbing even what they're watching on TV. It's really a lot of food for thought. And Epicurus was one of the greatest early Western philosophers on the nature of death.
Yeah.
But I
And
think from here, go on.
well, there was Epicurus. Um, I teach this philosophy class, and one of the questions on one of the exams is, or it used to be, we changed books, but Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who
Yeah.
followed Socrates and believed in
Yeah.
God and the soul, and
Yes.
Epicurus, they both had "Don't fear death" for opposite reasons. Or you know what it was? It was also it was the Bhagavad Gita, because Krishna says
Mhm.
also to Arjuna, "Don't fear death. No one on the
Right.
battlefield here is going to die. Souls are eternal, so don't worry about death." And Epicurus, who doesn't believe in a soul, he believes in the gods, but not any supreme God. He says, "Don't fear death, because when you're dead, you're gone." So whatever school of philosophy you're coming from, one of the issues they address is the fear of death.
Yeah.
I was just writing a class I'm going to be trying to sell online, and one of
Oh,
the
great.
major, yeah, it's like the hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics.
Oh,
And
I'll be your first student. I'll be your first paying customer.
yeah, and one of the books that I analyze in there is Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death, 1973 Pulitzer Prize winner.
Mhm.
He died just before that book came out of cancer. He was 50.
Yeah. Wow.
That's a great book. His theory was the major motivating principle of human life is the fear of death and the desire to deny death by perceiving ourselves as some hero of cosmic proportions whose heroics are appreciated by an omnipotent God. But that's the human imagination will be satisfied by nothing less than that. But sometimes you have philosophers who say, oh, there's no soul, and they're trying to address the fear of death as well.
Mm-hmm.
But what people find most satisfying isn't coming to terms with accepting the lack of their existence, but rather seeing their existence apotheosized, if that's a word, as becoming cosmic expansion of this heroic proportion. And Plato in the Symposium had Socrates quoting the priestess Diotima, and she said the same thing. She didn't say that fear of death motivates us so much. That was the theme in the Phaedo. But she said the desire to be a hero, an immortal hero, is what motivates all human beings. And the nobler you are, the more motivated you are to become some kind of a cosmic immortal hero. So when you emphasize the fear of death, that's what that brought to my mind.
Yeah, and when we get to the conclusion, and we lay out this catalog of what all these thinkers have suggested are the material artifacts, the anthropological, archaeological evidence of civilization and progress. If we follow Becker's thesis, we could say that all of that was created out of the fear of death as one of the most primordial human sensations or cognitions.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely his that fear of death and the desire to be an immortal hero that motivates the great achievements and the progress of civilization. It's all fueled by fear of death and a desire for immortality.
I haven't read that yet, but it is definitely on my short list. So I think that rounds out ancient Greece and Rome, ancient Greece, and we can now turn to ancient Rome and early Catholic theology in part 2 at stonefruit.substack.com. If you want to jump over there and do what I'm doing, I got half my screen is us and half my screen is the article. And I'll start going through part 2 of the history of the Western idea of progress. And I start with Lucretius. Now we're at 99 to 55 BC on the nature of things. And, I didn't rely on secondary material. I read significant chunks of the primary material of the ancient Greeks. And you know what my net assessment was, Todd?
What's that?
That it was one hell of a first draft of the Western mind.
Yeah.
And you know what my net assessment of ancient Rome is, powerful Tod Desmond?
What is it?
It's that it's one hell of a second draft of the Western mind.
Yeah. Yeah, the Romans were the students of the Greeks.
Yeah, they were. And they gradually started to add original thought. But Lucretius, in On the Nature of Things, he laid out all of these material artifacts, but he said that all these things practiced together with the acquired knowledge of the untiring mind taught men by slow degrees as they advanced on the way, step by step. And he too brought up the importance of education. And he said, quote, more and more every day, men who excelled in intellect and were of vigorous understanding would kindly show how to exchange their former way of living for the new methods. And he saw reason as an important to this journey. And he said, for this reason, our age cannot look back to what has gone before, save where reason points out any traces. So I think it wasn't just emulating the ancient Greeks for the sake of emulating them, but because the ancient Greeks saw how worthy their thought and practice was.
Yeah. The Romans took the Greek technology and the idea of a city-state to epic proportions.
Imperial proportions.
Yep.
So another Roman, Seneca, in his Natural Questions, he highlighted the importance of the human mind when he wrote that, quote, mental acumen and prolonged study will bring to light what is now hidden. The time will come when our successors will wonder how we could have been ignorant of things so obvious.
That reminds me of Thomas Jefferson and the Jefferson Memorial. On one of the walls, he writes something about you would no more expect a grown man to wear the same coat he did when he was a child as for civilization to wear the chiefs as our barbarous ancestors. That's a very progressive idea of not much respect for the ancient tradition. When he's saying this, I'm like, yeah, but at the same time, the history of academic physics has come full circle back to Plato's idea of this Akashic record, in the Timaeus, the mother substance. But you're tracing out the history of the idea of progress, and that's definitely what they're talking about here.
And a lot of Western thinkers, including Franklin among them, or Jefferson among them, looked at the age of a human being. They're young, they achieve maturity, and then they gradually degenerate, and then they die. And that became a framework, a template for them to look at civilization, which started to think, caused them to think in terms of the linear nature of time. Before contemporary science brought us back to maybe it is all a recurrence. And Seneca, in his moral letters to Lucilius, went through that typical catalog and inventory of the material stuff. But he also said that some of these things were, quote, invented by some man whose mind was nimble and keen, but not great or exalted. And the same holds true of any other discovery which can only be made by means of a bent body or of a mind whose gaze is upon the ground. That fascinated me because we think of these great quantum leaps of quote unquote progress in the Western mind and practice as by the great man theory of history. But Seneca was saying, not always, buddy. Sometimes these advances are made by people of a humble origin, of a humble place in the pecking order of society.
Yeah, sure. Well, Socrates was like that, barefoot and broke. He was a citizen, he wasn't a slave, but one of the poorest of the citizens.
Yeah, and one of my favorite ancient Greek philosophers, who is the most punk rock among them, Diogenes. He wasn't just barefoot, he had nothing.
Yeah,
but he was also respected as one of the smartest guys. And Alexander came to meet him, who was taught by Socrates, right? Or was he taught by Socrates or Aristotle?
Aristotle.
So he had a fine tutor, and he sought out Diogenes, and he stood over him. He was living in a wine amphora, a wine clay bottle. And Alexander's staring over him. What can I give you? What can I grant you? Diogenes says, you can get out of my light.
Yeah, get out of the sun.
But do you have part 2 up?
Yeah.
You want to read what Seneca said about the fundamental importance of education to progress, starting with associate with those?
Okay, he said, associate with those who will make a better man of you. Welcome those whom you yourself can improve. The process is mutual, for men learn while they teach. I know that. I learned a lot. True?
right?
Yeah, when I started teaching at the community college in Southern Maryland, I mean, that was great. I was getting paid chicken feed, but I was like, but I'm really learning more and more of just the basics of the history of philosophy. And it was a great class because it was Eastern and Western philosophy. So a lot of my videos on my YouTube channel are just I made for the class.
Yeah.
And it
And
was
I would
teaching that
encourage
what's
I
that?
would encourage any of our dozens of listeners go to your Tod Desmond at YouTube
My YouTube channel. It is Tod Desmond. That's the
because
name of it.
you have a video for basically every philosopher in the Western canon. And I haven't been
And the
teaching for a
Eastern.
decade, and Eastern. And I haven't been teaching for 10 years like you, but I've taught for 4 semesters here and there throughout my career. And I would say that Seneca is right. You do learn when you teach, and that's part of what makes it fun. And Seneca also said, much remains to do, much will remain, and no one born after thousands of centuries will be deprived of the chance of adding something in addition. So he's starting to inculcate the thought in Western historiography of progress that this is a very long, long process.
And there's, if you think like Socrates was talking about, the ultimate goal of knowledge is the idea of the good, and it contains all of the absolute ideas the material world we see. And it's infinite, it's endless. There's always new things that you can discover about the absolute core of being. So if you're trying to stake your immortal heroics on contributing to the intellectual progress of the human civilization, there's always going to be plenty out there for you
Yeah,
to
no
do.
doubt.
Yeah.
And we are striding forth towards it with this humble little podcast because we believe in free will and determinism at the same time.
Yeah, we do. Surfing the megaverse.
Because we want hundreds of thousands of viewers to have our ideas reach the wide currency they deserve. But if 40 views is what this universe among the multiverse ascribes to our endeavors, so be it.
So be not attached to your actions, says Arjuna. Just fight the battle.
Right. Don't wuss out. It is in your nature to be a great warrior. So after Seneca, we can get into early Christianity, and St. Augustine's City of God. It's quite a book, and I think its greatest value in the history of the idea of progress is setting out a teleology, divine providence, which is placed there by God, but it requires human activity to substantiate it, to have it come into the world. And like some of our earlier definitions of progress said, it presupposes a linear conception of time, and that it will be an improvement, and that it's in stages. And he offered a 7-stage periodization of progress from the Eden that you mentioned to the complexity of what will be a heaven on earth when Jesus returns prior to the final judgment.
Yeah, from Genesis to Apocalypse.
Yeah. And there is an incredible passage that I think it's too long for us to read here, but it's at stonefruit.substack.com in part 2 of the history of the Western idea of progress. City of God. It lays out all of these anthropological material artifacts that constitute civilization, but it's like a lifting of the veil, an opening of the eyes, a looking forth towards a broadly expansive horizon unfolding endlessly before his voice. And this is also he's a pivotal guy in the history of Western narrative too. So I won't read it because it's so long, but
He was also a
what
big Platonist.
was he?
Yep. He basically took Plato's cosmology and interpreted it with Christian terminology.
Mm,
So he called Plato's idea of the good, he called that God. And the idea of the good for Plato contains all of the other absolute ideas, like the idea of tree and the idea of justice, or whatever you can experience is rooted in some perfect form of that thing or
yeah,
concept. And Augustine interpreted that as the ideas in God's mind. And that the ideas in God's mind exist specifically at the outermost sphere of the universe, which Plato depicted Timaeus calling the mother substance, and Augustine calls that the mother of God. And that Jesus is the Logos, who's the walking incarnation of all of the absolute ideas of God's creative mind. Jesus lives out there at the horizon of the cosmos, and God the Father with the mother. And that's which the Hindus call Akasha. So so Augustine brought Platonism. Nietzsche called Christianity Platonism for the people. That's how
hmm,
he defined it. And it was St. Augustine who gave Platonism to the people. And his writings became the backbone of the medieval mind. And Aquinas picked it up 800 years after Augustine. He was more focused on Aristotle, but he still maintained a lot of the Platonic idea of this outermost sphere. Such a huge idea of the ancients of the East and the West. That was the mind of God for them. And that's why I'm so impressed with holographic string theory, because it's saying the same thing, but Susskind presents it in an atheistic light.
I knew there was a good reason I wanted to invite powerful Tod Desmond as my partner in this episode of Thought Crime and Wrong Think.
Is that what
So besides,
your series is called? Is it called Thought Crime?
no, it's called The Hard Line according to Stonefruit.
Oh, okay. Thought Crime is
But
cool.
it is a thought crime if we do it correctly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Hey,
after,
Socrates and Jesus were convicted of thought crime.
yeah, and Jesus was not a rabbi. He did not believe in credentialing.
Right. But they called him rabbi, I think, out of just deference to his ability.
Yeah. And actually, that's a decent segue to Joaquin of Fiore, because he was so into the Bible as a text. And for that reason, I think he can be seen as a forefather of hermeneutics and the interpretive bent of Western philosophy. Because he wasn't interested, as I am, I'm more interested in the religion of Christ, not the religion of Christianity. But he was very much interested in the Bible as a text. And I'm going to run through a little bit of his biography because he's just such an oddball figure. He started out as a royal court functionary, I believe, in Italy. Well, what would become Italy, a peninsula and islands that have had so many civilizations and conquerors come and go. He was a court functionary, and he went on a trip to the Holy Land and disavowed all things worldly, became a hermit for years, then a wandering preacher, then a member of a monastery, but he didn't take up the vows. But by then, he's becoming so celebrated as a learned and holy man that he became a founder of abbeys. And his work was rubber stamped with high approval by popes. And he was considered a writer of really creative, visionary interpretations of the Bible. And by the time you get to Aquinas, his teachings were considered heretical, but he himself was still so revered. I don't think he ever made saint, but he himself was so revered. They say, well, his teachings are heretical, but he himself is interesting, oddball, mutant genius. And he created this weird book called the Liber Figurorum. And he had such complex ideas that he tried to create them visually. And he made these really bizarre drawings that are like outsider art by schizophrenics of the 20th century that are just so complicated and so fascinating. So he's a really interesting oddball mutant genius that I was really happy to be turned on to. That's one thing I love about being an intellectual is finding shit that's new and funky and interesting to me. And his whole trip was, again, periodization, teleology. The first age was that as the Father and the law, the Old Testament. And then was the age of the Son, Jesus, the gospel. And he thought he was around 1200 AD. And he thought beginning right around his time was the age of the Spirit. And that would yield, quote, absolute peace, tranquility, freedom, and contentment. And he had such a stature in his day that Richard the Lionhearted actually met with him on his way to the Third Crusade and got some good insights and girding of the loin from Joachim of Fiore. And so for me, the thing I take most out of early Catholic Church, which is a breakaway from Orthodox, a heretical breakaway from the Orthodox Church, but they were really big on periodization, teleology. Time is linear, it's continuous, and it is moving towards the kingdom of God on earth, but then the final judgment. But the kingdom of God on earth part is said to be nice, a nice prospect to look forward to.
Yeah, but it follows the Armageddon, the Battle of Armageddon, and all the plagues being dropped on the earth from the angels above, and what is it? Half the people are going to die. In the Gospels, Jesus says somewhere about in the last days, 2 women will be standing at the well, 1 will be left, 2 men will be in the field, 1 will be left. So like half the Earth's population is going to die, and so
yeah,
it's similar to Zoroastrianism. Has the same philosophy. They were the first ones to have the idea of the dead rising from the grave to be judged a second time, and then the unjust ones will be burned up in a molten river of metal, which will then flow into hell and fill up hell, and there'll be no more evil God. What is it? Ahura Mazda and Agra Manyu. Ahura Mazda is the good God, Agra Manyu is the evil God. Anyway, it's very similar. I teach that in the Intro to Religion class. But
it's
when
amazing.
Jesus comes back, he'll rule as the king of the earth, and all the resurrected people will be just, and it'll be heaven on earth.
I'm a big fan of Karl Jasper's thesis of the axial age. From about 800 to 400 BC, you started as humankind left the Neolithic era into pre-modernity. All throughout the world, you see all of these different culturally bound, historically situated quantum leaps in the moral and creative and aesthetic imagination. Like you mentioned, Zoroaster, Pythagoras and the pre-Socratics, Confucius, Buddha, Moses, all pop up at roughly the same time. And a lot of them all have similar myths, images, narratives.
Yeah, Richard Tarnas talks about that and he traces out the astrology involved with that. I know one of his points was that Neptune and Jupiter, when they are like conjunct, I guess opposite in the square, the four quadratures, then you have new philosophies emerging like Platonism and then Christianity. And this diachronic unfolding of that alignment between Jupiter, the god of expansion and success and joviality, and Neptune, which was not known to the ancients, but has been equated with spirituality and illusion and infinite depths. And those two archetypes working together open up the mind to new religions and philosophies.
Yeah, these myths were personifying natural processes, human characteristics, human activities. It was just a different way to make order of the universe around us. I think I promised to, I want to respect your time, and I said 2 hours, and we're there now. But if we could move towards the conclusion, I wanted to go through all of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans about what individually they had contributed to what I've been calling repeatedly the material culture, the archaeological record, the anthropological version of what is civilization, what is progress. And since we're past 2 hours, I don't want to do that, but the general idea is that it's stuff that we've mentioned a lot. It's urbanization, it's domestication of animals, agriculture, open sea navigation, war, military implements. And since I didn't read the St. Augustine City of God, maybe I can just read what he considered the material artifacts that denote progress are, and then we can jump into our discussion of Kant and Nietzsche to close this out.
Okay.
So what St. Augustine said that proved that we are in the moment of progress when he wrote was weaving, building, agriculture, navigation, pottery, painting, sculpture, theater, hunting, weapons, engines of destruction, medicine, cuisine, speaking, writing, eloquence, song, musical instruments, measures, numbers, astronomy, natural philosophy, heretics, and philosophers. Raymond Williams, one of the great post-Marxists, wrote a great book called Keywords, and one of the most important words is culture. And he had a 3-part analysis. It was culture in terms of agriculture and animal husbandry, culture in terms of the anthropological definition of different societies whose existence is indicated by a list, kind of like what I just read, or in what's the kind of the high arts version of culture. And as the thing I liked about St. Augustine and Joachim of Fiore in terms of providing us with periodization and teleologies, the divine providence immanent in the unfolding of history may have been placed there by God, but it required human activity to actualize itself. God gave man reason, which enables societies to progress as individuals do in knowledge and skill as they age, to fulfill his plan of a linear historical progression composed of developmental stages, inevitable, utopian, millenarial. And here's where we lay out the groundwork for part 3 on stonefruit.substack.com, is that this is the structure of thought that when secularized in the Enlightenment begins to acquire the contours of the modern Western idea of progress. And in part 3, which I hope you will join me for, Powerful Tod Desmond, will look at numerous philosophers, a representative sampling of the philosophers of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and to give everybody a sweet taste of the philosophers to come, just a sweet taste. I want to look at Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment? And I don't know about you, you have a more profound grasp of the main classics of Western philosophy than I do. I can't make heads or tail out of most of what Kant has written. But
I definitely feel like I'm earning my money when I teach Kant. I'm like, okay, good. I serve a purpose because this guy's hard to understand.
Pre-existing concepts. Okay, I think I can get that as one of his main ideas. But his short essay, What is Enlightenment, really is one that I come to again and again and again and again. And he said that, quote, enlightenment is man's leaving his self-caused immaturity. Immaturity is the incapacity to use one's intelligence without the guidance of another. Such immaturity is self-caused. It is not caused by lack of intelligence, but by the lack of determination and courage to use one's intelligence without being guided by another. He offers us an injunction in Latin that I even had to look up on YouTube how to pronounce correctly. Sapere aude, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own intelligence is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. So in his essay, he's jumping back and forth between enlightenment as a social period and enlightenment as something that the individual intellectual can achieve for themselves. And he says that most of us in society are too lazy and cowardly to use the reason that we do have and the information that is available to us to improve our estate. And if you have before you the piece that I suggested as our possible conclusion, would you like to grace us with what Nietzsche said in the classic essay Schopenhauer as Educator on a very similar train of thought?
Yeah, I like that one because it reminds me of my idea that the psyche is the singularity. So I'll read that. Schopenhauer's Educator, 1876. Nietzsche focuses on mankind's laziness, according to the great corn god, Boris Brown. So here's what Nietzsche says. Each of us bears a productive uniqueness within him as the core of his being. And when he becomes aware of it, there appears around him a strange penumbra, which is the mark of his singularity. Most find this something unendurable because they are, as aforesaid, lazy, and because a chain of toil and burdens is suspended from this uniqueness. There can be no doubt that for the singular man who encumbers himself with this chain, life withholds almost everything: cheerfulness, security, ease, honor, that he desired of it in his youth. I like that one because here I am, having sacrificed my youth. And where's my cheerfulness, security, ease, and honor?
We don't have them.
I'm a little cheery. That's from being punch drunk.
Because we have not agreed to follow the conventional path that society has laid out for us of going to school, getting married, have 2.1 kids, a house, a mortgage, a car payment, a 50-week a year job. We have voluntarily withheld all of these things from ourselves.
Yeah. Well, he's saying life withholds it from you. It's like, yep.
And I concur,
With
which
us
is
living
why,
on the we were living on the outskirts of the Hare Krishna cult. That's how we were eating you.
yep,
Me at the University of Hawaii, working for the Hare Krishnas, the California Institute of Integral Studies, and Richard Tarnas was interviewing me. He was a little wary of letting me in the program. He's like, I don't know about letting some kind of a Hare Krishna in here because aren't you guys kind of dogmatic and everything? I was like, yeah, but I'm on the fringe of the Hare Krishnas. He's like, oh, so you're on the fringe of the fringe. I was like, yeah,
yes,
that's
I
where I
am.
am.
Yeah, even though I've got 2 masters and a PhD, and I'm now being a nurse aide, I call that my punk rock tax.
Yeah, right. But you know
And
what? This
it,
quote, I just want to go over here,
please do.
which I've read Schopenhauer's Educator, but maybe my translation didn't have it. But he says, each of us bears a productive uniqueness within him as the core of his being. And when he becomes aware of it, there appears around him a strange penumbra, which is the mark of his singularity. I mean, my whole theory is the psyche is the gravitational singularity. And even though there's an infinite number of singularities, they're all identical according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. It's a point with zero volume and infinite density. They all contain all of the megaverse of universes. But he's saying the core of our being is the singularity, and then a strange penumbra, like a event horizon of a black hole, appears around you. And according to Susskind, the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe is contained on each point of it, an event horizon of a black hole or the horizon of the cosmos itself. And I've seen Nietzsche use this mandala model of the human being before, and this is another. This was a great discovery for my theory, psyche equals singularity, to find this one. So this was the best gem of the 2 papers I read. I was like, wow, this one's huge for me.
Yeah. As with What is Enlightenment by Kant in 1784, I believe, I come to that again and again. And Nietzsche's Schopenhauer's Educator, I come back to again and again. They're both short. They're both really impactful to me. And another thing that Nietzsche said a little elsewhere in Schopenhauer's Educator is when the great thinker despises human beings, he despises their laziness. For it is on account of their laziness that he considers them as manufactured goods, unimportant and unworthy to be associated with or instructed. Human beings who do not want to belong to the mass need only to stop being comfortable, follow their conscience, which cries out, be yourself. All that you are doing now, thinking and desiring, is not really yourself. So the ancient Greeks were really big on fate, fortune, and necessity. Well, fate and necessity. The Romans brought in more of a sense of fortune. And I would argue that modern social theory in various iterations in the humanities and the social science has its own version of fate and necessity. I would say that for Freud, the unconscious takes away a lot of what we like to think of as our free will. Mm-hmm. As Heidegger's dictum, language speaks, die Sprache spricht. Language speaks man. Language is a pre-existing system that existed before an individual speaker and will exist after the individual speaker passes. And the founder of linguistics, de Saussure, has a concept of langue and parole, language and speech, which I also see as kind of like the Brahman and Atman. Brahman is the language, the vastness, and speech is the activity, the Atman, the individuation.
I like that's a good analogy. Yeah, language is the potential for speech, and speech is the actualization of that potential.
And I think Heidegger and de Saussure were both onto that. And, you know, one of these social theorist that just wrote an important book every 2 years for a while there in the 80s and 90s. Anthony Giddens, he had a concept called structuration. Structure is all the things that we can't control. And ation is action. It's what we can. He invented a cognate word to have all the things outside of our control and where free will exists. And to almost close this out, on one of the masters, Karl Marx, in his 1852, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, he said, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." Marx had few equals for a punchy phrase.
Yeah.
But it is those nightmares of previous generations that I hope to look into in part 3 of this when I get into the philosophers and the material and social limitations that we all now face as humans on planet Earth now that will make progress impossible to sustain in the very near term future. So I want to thank you, Brother Tod Desmond, for joining me on this intellectual journey. And I want to close this out by doing a mash it up, man, of Kant and Nietzsche. C'est du selbst. Sapere. I better get it right if I'm going to do it. C'est du selbst. C'est du selbst. Sapere aude. C'est du selbst. That's German. Sapere aude. That's Latin. Be yourself. Dare to know. This has been another stirring edition of The Hardline, according to Stonefruit, with my special guest, friend, and intellectual comrade at arms, Tod Desmond. Signing off. Adios.
Adios.